She lived alone in a house that time had quietly abandoned. Tucked away at the end of an overgrown path, past fields no longer plowed and fences leaning like tired bones, the small stone cottage had stood for nearly a century. The shutters hung askew, the chimney leaned slightly to the left, and ivy crept steadily up its walls, as if trying to hold the house in place. It was the kind of place you wouldn't notice unless you were looking for it, and no one had been looking for her in a very long time. For 25 years, the woman inside followed the same quiet rhythm. Every morning, she rose before the sun, boiled a small kettle on an old iron stove, and poured the hot water over a single tea bag in the same chipped white mug. She would sit by the window as the fog lifted off the fields and sip her tea in silence. Afterward, she would tend to the rose bushes in her garden, not out of pride or joy, but from habit. The roses didn't bloom like they used to, but she cared for them anyway. There was a peace in the routine, a comfort in knowing what each moment of the day would bring. No one had knocked on her door in all those years. The mail stopped coming long ago. The townspeople barely spoke of her anymore. Some said she had once been married, others thought she'd been widowed young. There were rumors about a daughter, about a loss so heavy it bent her into silence. But the truth was, no one remembered clearly. She had faded from memory as quietly as she had faded from life. People no longer knew whether she was still alive, or just haunting the house with her absence. Children dared one another to run up to the gate and touch it, but none stayed long enough to see if the curtains moved. Dogs barked at the fence but wouldn't cross the line where the weeds grew thick and wild. Once, many years ago, a man from the gas company had come to check the meter. He knocked, waited, then left. He said later that the silence behind the door had been too complete, like the air itself was holding its breath. Inside the house, the rooms were clean, but still. Dust floated through narrow shafts of light. The clock on the mantel had stopped ticking long ago, but she had never reset it. The calendar on the wall still read the year 1998, not because she didn't know time was passing, but because she no longer needed it to. Time had lost its urgency, its shape. It no longer mattered what day it was, only that the tea was made, the roses were watered, and the quiet was respected. But then came a night not unlike any other when the air shifted. A breeze rolled in from the east, and the wind chimes on. The porch stirred for the first time in months. The woman stood at the window longer than usual, her mug untouched on the sill. There was no knock, no footsteps. But she felt it, a weight in the air, a presence just beyond the garden gate. Something was different, something or someone had arrived. And though the house remained still, though the silence held like it always had, she knew deep down that the long quiet was about to end. The attic had remained untouched for nearly as long as the rest of the world had remained untouched by her. It wasn't that she avoided it, it was simply forgotten. A space sealed away by time and dust and the quiet fear of memory. But that morning, something stirred her, a draft in the hallway, a creak in the ceiling, a sound too soft to call a sound, but just enough to lift her eyes toward the narrow staircase that disappeared above the kitchen. She lit a small oil lamp, the same one she'd used during long winter storms, and ascended the creaking steps. Each board moaned beneath her weight, as if surprised to be disturbed. The attic smelled of cedar and paper, of age and storage and stillness. Boxes stacked haphazardly, old trunks with broken locks, folded linens yellowed with time. She didn't come looking for anything in particular. Perhaps she wasn't looking at all. But her hands found a box beneath a quilt she barely remembered owning. Inside, among brittle letters and rusted brooches, was an old photo album. The leather was cracked, the binding loose, its edges flaking like dried leaves. She sat down beside the small window where light filtered in like mist and opened the cover with care. Most pages were blank or filled with indistinct scenes, picnics, faces she couldn't name, places that felt familiar but not quite real. But near the center she paused. One photo had been altered. 10 figures stood in a row, some smiling, others solemn, but their faces had been scratched out. Not torn or burned, but gently erased, as if someone had run their thumb across the surface until only shadows remained. Their bodies were still visible, their hands, their clothes, but the faces were gone. Only one remained untouched. A woman, standing slightly apart, hands clasped before her, her eyes looking just past the camera. It was her, much younger, unmistakably her. She stared for a long time. There was a flicker at the edge of her memory, but it faded before she could catch it. She closed the album, suddenly aware of how cold the attic had become. The lamp trembled slightly in her hand as she descended the stairs, the photo pressed to her chest. That night, she couldn't sleep. The wind returned, brushing against the windows like a whisper. The chimes on the porch clinked softly, as if something had passed beneath them. And in her dream, they stood again, the 10 figures, this time clear, vivid, alive. They stood in a circle beneath an open sky, saying nothing, simply watching her. Their eyes full of something ancient and unfinished. She didn't speak. She couldn't. The woman from the photo, her younger self, stood beside them, but turned to face her. And in that moment, she felt something she hadn't felt in years. Not fear, not sorrow. Recognition. When she awoke, the photo album was still beside her, its cover slightly open. And from the porch, carried in on the wind, came the faintest sound like footsteps across old wooden boards. Evening came early in that part of the world, especially in the colder months. The light thinned around the hills like a breath slowly fading, and the shadows of the rosebush grew long and soft across the front steps. She had spent most of the day in silence, the album resting open on her lap, her eyes drifting over the erased faces again and again, as if willing them to return. She hadn't eaten. She'd barely moved. It was the kind of stillness that settled into a house when grief was nearby, quiet, patient, invisible. Then, just as the last of the sun dipped below the ridge, the knock came. It wasn't loud, not demanding. Just a single deliberate tap, like someone asking not for entry, but for permission. She froze in her chair. The teacup in her hand shook ever so slightly, the sound of the spoon against the porcelain unnaturally loud in the quiet room. For a long moment, she didn't move. No one had knocked on her door in decades. The mailman left things at the gate. Strangers didn't find this place. Neighbors no longer tried. But the knock came again. She rose slowly, her knees stiff from the cold. At the door, she paused, her hand hovering above the old brass handle. She wasn't afraid, not exactly. It felt more like stepping into a memory she hadn't lived yet. Finally, she opened the door. A man stood on the threshold. He was elderly, perhaps in his 70s, wearing a long gray coat and a wool cap pulled low over his ears. His face was lined, his eyes dark but calm. He carried no bag, no umbrella, nothing that marked him as a traveler. For a moment, they simply looked at each other. Then he spoke. "I saw you," he said softly, almost apologetically. "In my dream." There was no hesitation in his voice, no doubt. It wasn't a question. It wasn't a plea. It was a fact, one that felt ancient and known, even if neither of them understood it. The woman didn't respond. She stepped aside, and the man entered. He walked with slow, careful steps into the parlor and sat in the armchair across from hers, as if he had done so many times before. He looked around once, taking in the faded curtains, the quiet fire, the untouched teacup. Then he folded his hands in his lap and stared into the silence. He didn't speak again. She didn't ask him to. They sat together for a long time, 10 minutes, maybe an hour. Time had never meant much in that house, and tonight, it seemed to stop altogether. When the man finally rose, he did so without ceremony. He walked to the door, nodded once, a gesture of thanks, or perhaps farewell, and stepped out into the dark. She didn't follow. She stood at the doorway for a long time after he had gone, her hands cold, her breath visible in the crisp night air. Somewhere far off an owl called once and then fell silent. The wind had died. The chimes were still. But something inside the house inside her had shifted. A door that had stayed closed for a quarter century had been opened. And though she didn't know why, she felt certain it wouldn't be the last knock. The next evening, at the same hour when the sun's last warmth slipped behind the hills and the shadows returned to their usual places, there came another knock. It was soft, deliberate like the one before it, and she knew before she opened the door that someone else would be there. She wasn't surprised, not anymore. A woman stood on the porch this time. Middle-aged, wrapped in a dark blue coat, her cheeks pink from the wind. Her eyes were wide, but not fearful, more like someone who had walked through fog and was relieved to have arrived. She clutched a folded paper in her hand but didn't offer it. Instead, she said the exact same words as the man before her. "I saw you in my dream." That was all. The older woman said nothing. She stepped aside, let the visitor in, and watched as she took the same seat in the parlor, the one by the fire, now burning low. They sat without speaking, the ticking of the broken clock above the mantel sounding louder than it should, even though it hadn't worked in years. The guest stayed just long enough for the quiet to settle, then nodded and left. No questions. No farewells. The following night it happened again. This time it was a boy, no older than 17. His shoes were muddy, his coat too thin. He stood at the door with his hands buried in his pockets and eyes that looked older than they should. And he said it too. "I saw you in my dream." By the fourth visitor, she no longer hesitated to open the door. They came one by one, night after night. A teacher from a neighboring town, a man in military uniform, a woman in nurse's scrubs. Each of them different age, race, background, expression, and yet there was something shared in the way they carried themselves. Like they had all woken from the same dream and followed the same path through fog, road, and memory to arrive at her doorstep. None of them knew each other. None of them stayed long. And all of them, without fail, spoke the same sentence. She kept a notepad by her chair. Now, not to write names, none of them gave any, but to mark how many had come. And perhaps more importantly, how many more she felt were still on their way. The number 10 flickered at the edge of her thoughts, unspoken but certain. What unsettled her wasn't the pattern, it was the familiarity. There was something in their faces she couldn't explain. A kind of echo, as though she had once known them all, or would know them someday, if given time. Her sleep became restless. She saw the faces in her dreams now too clearer each night. They stood in a circle, waiting, their lips sealed, their eyes fixed on her. Each knock deepened the silence in the house. Each visit was like a breath held between worlds. And still, no one in town came near. No one asked about the lights, the visitors, the soft footsteps on the gravel path. As if everyone understood, without needing to be told, that something was happening in the old house at the edge of the hills, something ancient and slow and too quiet for words. The photo album had been left open for days now, resting on the table beside her chair, its spine sagging with age, the pages curling ever so slightly at the corners, as if breathing in the silence of the room. She hadn't planned to revisit it so often, but each evening, after the newest stranger had come and gone, she found herself drawn back to the same image, the one with 10 faceless figures, and the younger version of herself standing just beside them, her expression unreadable. At first, the photograph had seemed like an enigma, a strange, damaged memory, too vague to understand and too specific to ignore. But lately, something had changed. Something quiet and irreversible. She began to see faces, not all at once, and not with clarity at first. But with every visitor, the photo shifted subtly, almost imperceptibly, like time rewinding in reverse, painting back what had once been erased. The first face that returned was that of the old man, the one who had arrived on the very first night. His solemn eyes, his weathered mouth, the shape of his shoulders. All of it now visible in the photo where once there had been only a smudge. She didn't question it. She didn't try to explain it. She simply looked, and the picture looked back. The second face came the next evening, the middle-aged woman in the blue coat. Her profile emerged slowly, the way a memory returns when you're not trying to remember. Then the young boy, then the soldier, then the nurse. One by one, they filled in, as if the act of their arrival in the present had pulled something ancient back into focus, as if they were not strangers at all, but returning pieces of a life she had once lived and forgotten. She stopped writing in the notebook. Numbers no longer seemed to matter. Instead, she sat for long hours in the armchair, studying the photograph like scripture. She traced the outlines of the faces with her finger, whispering the same sentence they had whispered to her. "I saw you." In my dream, it wasn't just a greeting anymore, it was a key, a code, a door opening. With each arrival, her sleep grew deeper, her dreams more vivid. And always the same circle appeared, 10 people, standing in a ring around her waiting. Not demanding, not threatening, just present. Witnesses to something she could not yet name. In their silence was an invitation, a calling, a return. She realized, one late night while the fire crackled low and the wind tapped gently at the windows, that the photo had not been defaced, it had been waiting. Not erased, but unfinished. And now, slowly, it was completing itself. There was only one space left to fill, and deep in her chest, where memory and longing had once slept untouched for decades, she felt something stir, like a puzzle almost finished, like a story just before the final page. By the time the 6th visitor arrived, she no longer questioned the silence that followed each knock. She no longer hesitated before opening the door. She simply waited, and when the time came, always just after dusk, never sooner, never later. She stood, crossed the room, and turned the knob as if completing a ritual older than memory. The strangers came quietly, each one different from the last, and each one carrying a story that was never quite spoken, but always somehow understood. There was the man with the limp and the faded military coat, who stood at the threshold, with his cap pressed to his chest and eyes filled with something older than grief. He didn't speak at first. When he finally did, he whispered, "I was lost in the forest once. I followed the sound of bells. You were there." And then he sat by the fire, not saying another word, his fingers trembling softly as if remembering something he had once buried and had now found again. Then came the woman with tired hands, a nurse from another town, or maybe from another time. She carried an envelope, sealed and never opened, with an address written in handwriting she no longer recognized. She said she had been dreaming of a room with blue wallpaper and a window that faced the east. When she stepped into the house, she paused, looked around and said, "This is it." She wept quietly in the chair for a while, then stood and left the envelope on the table without explanation. There was also a child, no more than 10, who said nothing at all. He simply placed a small toy on the windowsill and sat beside the woman without speaking. When he finally did stand to leave, he looked back once, smiled, and vanished into the mist like a memory that had finally been released. Each visitor brought with them not just a presence, but a weight the kind carried not in hands, but in silence. They didn't ask for help. They didn't need food or comfort. What they needed was acknowledgement, a place to be seen and to see. She began to understand slowly that they were not coming to her, not entirely. They were coming to the place, to the memory, to the convergence of paths where something had once been lost and was now quietly being found. Some had wounds that never healed, others carried names they no longer spoke. But all of them had dreamed of her. All of them had walked the same narrow road that twisted through woods and fog and quiet nights, drawn by something they couldn't name. And all of them, in their own way, had arrived bearing a part of the same story, fragments of a shared past waiting to be reassembled. The woman no longer feared the knock at the door. She was beginning to remember. She never asked them why they had come. She never questioned their faces, or their stories, or the strange threads that seemed to weave between them. Instead, she greeted them all the same with a soft nod, a quiet gesture toward the chair by the fire, and a cup of tea, steeped in the same chipped mug she had always used. The house had no need for questions. Its walls had learned to listen better than any living thing. Each visitor settled into the space differently. Some sat stiffly, unsure of how to be still. Others sank into the cushions like they had been waiting for years to rest. But always, after the first few moments, something changed. Their shoulders dropped, their breathing slowed. They would look at her, really look, and then down at their hands, as if the act of being seen so clearly had startled them. Her gaze was not warm nor cold. It was not heavy with pity or dulled by time. It was still, and in that stillness, each of them saw something they had long forgotten, themselves. She never interrupted. She never offered advice nor platitudes. She did not nod with understanding, nor murmur with sympathy. She simply poured tea, sat across from them, and listened with her presence. Sometimes she smiled, a small fleeting thing like sunlight through a crack in the curtain. Sometimes her hands trembled when they reached for the pot, though not from age, from memory. What passed between them in those silent exchanges was never spoken aloud, but it was felt deeply, like warmth in winter bones, like a name remembered after being lost. When the time came for them to leave, none of them ever asked for directions. They simply rose, some wiping tears from their cheeks, others pausing at the threshold, as if unsure whether they were stepping out or stepping back. Not a single one of them left unchanged. A man once placed his hand on the doorframe before walking out and whispered, "I didn't know I needed healing until now." A young girl stood in the kitchen doorway for several minutes, tears slipping down her cheeks as she clutched a locket she hadn't opened in years. Another, an old woman with eyes like brittle glass, reached out to touch the host's hand and simply said, "You remind me of someone I loved." But the woman said nothing. She didn't need to. Her silence was not absence, it was presence. It filled the space between stories. It wrapped around grief like gauze, letting it breathe without bleeding. In her eyes, each visitor found a reflection of something they thought they had lost forever. A brother, a child, a second chance, a prayer left unanswered. Somehow, in this forgotten house at the edge of the hills, strangers came not to be taught or saved, but to be seen fully. And it was enough. Every evening, when the last of the visitors had gone and the chimes on the porch grew still again, she returned to her chair by the fire. She did not weep. She did not write anything down. She sat, hands folded in her lap, and waited. Because she knew tomorrow someone else would come, and she would see them too. By the 9th night, the routine had taken on the shape of something sacred. The woman would light the small lamp by the doorway just before dusk. She would set the kettle on the stove, not because the water needed boiling, but because it felt like something that should be done. And then she would wait. Not in expectation, not in hope, simply in stillness. As if some ancient rhythm had settled into her bones, and all that remained was to listen for its next quiet beat. The knock came a little later that night. The wind was heavier, the clouds lower. The hills around the house seemed closer, as if they had crept inward with the evening cold. When she opened the door, the man standing there was already looking past her, as though he had seen the house in his mind long before he'd ever arrived. He said the same words as all the others. "I saw you. In my dream." But something in his voice held an echo like an old bell rung once and then forgotten. She let him in, as she had done with the others, and he took the chair across from her. He was older than most, not in years, but in weight. His shoulders carried something unseen, something ancient. He didn't touch the tea. He didn't speak again. He simply sat, his eyes drifting over the room with a familiarity that unsettled her. Then, small things began to shift. The air felt thicker, as though the past had begun to breathe again. The fire snapped louder than usual, its embers glowing, with a heat that reached not just the skin, but the memory. On the window pane, a single patch of condensation appeared, the kind left by a resting palm, though neither of them had touched the glass. The scent in the room changed, subtly. Rosewood and lavender, like the kind her mother used to keep in drawers she was never allowed to open. And from the hallway, the old grandfather clock, broken for years, ticked once, just once. But enough to suggest that time had slipped, folded itself inward. The man did not react, but she did, not visibly, not aloud. But something stirred within her, not quite recognition, but something adjacent to it. A sense of being remembered by something she herself had forgotten. A whisper in the blood. The weight of a name once spoken in love and then buried. She looked to the man, and for a heartbeat, she felt the shape of a memory press against the edge of her mind, the curve of a hand on her shoulder, a voice reading aloud from a worn book, a shadow standing at the kitchen door during a storm. And then it was gone. The man stood, bowed his head slightly, and left without looking back. The door clicked shut behind him, but the silence that followed was different. Not empty full. Not cold waiting. She remained seated for a long time, her hands resting on the fabric of her skirt, her eyes fixed on the window and that single breath mark that still lingered. The house around her felt older, closer, as if its walls remembered something she had yet to recall. And deep inside her, a door had begun to creak open. She did not know yet what waited behind it, but she knew that final visitor would come soon. The 10th night arrived not with a knock, but with a presence. The air changed first, not colder, not warmer, just aware. The wind outside quieted to a hush, and even the trees seemed to stand still, their leaves holding their breath. Inside the house, the woman sat with the teacup untouched in her lap, its warmth long since faded, though her hands didn't move to refresh it. She was waiting, but this time, not with calm. Something deeper stirred, a tension threaded with both. Dread and longing. When the knock finally came, it was softer than the others, barely audible, as though the visitor wasn't knocking on the door, but through it, from some place not entirely within this world. The woman stood slowly, her bones aching not from age, but from memory. Every step to the door felt like walking backward in time, like being drawn into the shape of something she had once loved and lost. She opened it, and there, beneath the dim porch light, stood a young woman. She could have been 20, maybe a little more. Her coat was simple, her hair pulled back in a way that exposed her delicate features. But it wasn't the clothes or the posture that made the older woman freeze. It was the eyes. They were wide and familiar, impossibly so. The kind of familiarity that hurt to recognize. The girl didn't smile. She didn't speak the usual words. Instead, she said quietly, "I didn't want to leave." And then the older woman knew. It wasn't just a visitor. It wasn't just another dreamwalker, another name without a past. It was her daughter, the one she had buried 25 years ago beneath a sycamore tree now half swallowed by ivy. The one whose absence had silenced birthdays, who had once danced barefoot in the hallway, who had asked to stay up just a little longer that final night, gone too young, too fast. And yet here she was, standing with time suspended in the cold dusk air. The woman stepped back without thinking, allowing her in. The girl entered slowly, reverently, as though retracing steps she'd once taken in smaller shoes. She glanced at the fireplace, the framed photographs, the slightly uneven floorboard by the kitchen door. And then she turned to face her mother. They stared at one another in silence. And in that silence, time folded. Not metaphorically, literally. The edges of the room wavered, as if seen through tears or smoke. The house seemed to sigh, its old wood groaning gently, not from strain, but from remembrance. The mirror in the hallway clouded, not from steam or dust, but from the past pressing against the glass. Even the ticking of the broken clock returned for a single beat, as if granting permission. The woman reached forward, her hand trembling as it hovered above the girl's cheek. But she didn't touch. She didn't have to. The girl nodded. Once, barely, as if to say, "I know." And with that, something within both of them shifted. Not healed, not forgotten, but seen, named, acknowledged. The girl stepped toward the door again, pausing to look back once, just long enough to leave behind a final image, not of sorrow, but of peace. And then she was gone. The house held its breath and exhaled. The morning crept in quietly, without ceremony. There were no birds this time, just the soft rustle of leaves and the long shadow of dawn stretching across the earth like a ribbon being slowly unfurled. The wind came gently from the east, the way it used to when she would wake early to water her roses before the sun got too high. But this morning, no one moved inside the house. No footsteps. No kettle on the stove. No fire to stir the coals. The front door was open, not wide, but slightly ajar, as though someone had stepped through it, not in haste, but with a kind of grace. It did not creak. It did not sway. It simply breathed. Inside, the house was untouched and yet somehow transformed. The air felt different, not heavier, but fuller, as if something had been completed, and in that completion, left behind a presence rather than an absence. The rocking chair near the fireplace was still. The table was clean. The rugs were swept. The teacup rested, clean and upturned on its saucer, and in her favorite armchair, precisely as if placed there with quiet purpose, lay the old photo album. Its spine had softened with years of use. The corners curled slightly, as though it too had aged with time. But the page it rested on, that page had changed. 10 faces now smiled back in full, no blurs, no ghosts. Their features were clear, their eyes familiar. They were laughing, or maybe listening to something just outside the frame. And in the center, the woman sat not as she was in age, but as she had once been, radiant and still, her hands folded gently in her lap, her expression peaceful. The kind of peace that arrives only after something long waited for has finally returned home. By the front step, beneath the old rocking chair, someone found a note weighed down with a stone. On the paper, written in her own careful hand, were the words, "Some roads lead back home, even if we forget how to walk them." Beneath that, nothing more, no name, no date. But tucked into the fold of the note was a single dried rose from her garden, fragile, whole. Neighbors whispered. Some swore they'd seen a figure walking into the trees just before the sun crested the hill. Others said they heard the sound of humming, faint as breath, echoing in the kitchen. But most said nothing. They only nodded. Because those who had once stepped through her door, whether in dreams or in waking, knew what it meant to leave lighter than you arrived. The woman was gone. But the house was not empty. It remembered. It always had, and perhaps tonight, in some other quiet town, another door will open without sound. A stranger will arrive, holding a memory they cannot name. And they too will sit in a chair beside a fire, sip tea in silence, and see their reflection in someone who simply listens.